Hi everyone, this is Morgan, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about Journal 3, aka Illusionary Space Exercises, our third journal again for the character collage. So this is outlined pretty thoroughly on Canvas, so I'm going to pull up that page for you now. Here you can see that I walk you through what this looks like. You need to create one study of 1-point perspective. That's shown here. You also need to create a page showing a change in value and color of receding objects, and a third that shows a change to the level of detail. These are different ways that you can create illusionary space, and as a reminder, you need to utilize 2 of these in your character collage. So, another reminder, I am using Photoshop as a way to build my Journal 3 pieces. You can absolutely use Photoshop. Here you'll see I'm highlighting a place where you can download a template if you plan to use Photoshop to build Journal 3. If you feel more comfortable with drawing and less comfortable with Photoshop, by all means just draw. You don't need to employ advanced drawing techniques to do this assignment. So if you're more comfortable sketching, great. If you got some comfort with Photoshop due to our last project, awesome. Pick whatever sounds easier to you. The next thing I'm going to do is return to my objects folder of source images that I created for my second process journal. If you're drawing, these will just be reference images. Since I'm choosing to work with Photoshop, they are my source material. I'm going to begin by pulling that bonnet file into Photoshop. And if you've taken a little bit of a breather from Photoshop, what I'm doing here is just selecting the magic wand tool. I try to select subject. Sometimes that works really well as just a way to select a unified subject. Photoshop didn't do the best job, so I end up having to go in manually to do this here. You'll see I zoom in. I click on the black because the black is my actual subject. I don't need the white detail. I uncheck contiguous, so I'm able to select all the black pixels in the image. And that's going to allow me to just bring in the outline of the bonnet. That makes it a little bit more flexible to work with. That's honestly not hyper essential for this particular exercise. It's just good practice for me in case I want to overlap this image down the road. So now you can see I'm pulling out the tab that contains the bonnet and now has a beautiful new layer mask. And I'm going to use the Move tool in Photoshop to drag this into my template document that I downloaded from Canvas. I didn't really talk about this, but what the template really contains is pretty simple. You could obviously create it yourself, but you have a horizon line at the top and you have these 2 vanishing lines being drawn out from it. So I have only included 2. Some of you may find it easier to either draw more for yourself or add more here in Photoshop. I start out with this bonnet file basically just by trying to get it to fill, a big swath basically of this foreground chunk within the 2 vanishing lines. And as I move a copied layer, and again, I just used Command J to make a duplicate layer. Once I created the duplicate layer, I resized it so it could kind of fit within the vanishing lines a little further back in space. So I'm readjusting a little bit so they are more close to either end of the vanishing line. I need to keep readjusting and keep moving my bonnet image. That's normal. I need you to include at least 3 distinct size variations within each study. So I'm doing my third here. And again, this is just the study where I purely explore 1-point perspective. So this will complete this particular exercise within the Journal 3 exercises. So hopefully you can see, even just with only diminishing size, but trying to get this to line up exactly with 1-point perspective, we are beginning to create the illusion of space just with that technique alone. So this is the first part of Journal 3 completely done. You'll see here I'm going to save as, and this is just that, again, good practice work of saving it as Journal 3 _ linear perspective. And you could definitely save this as a PDF. That's what it's defaulting to in Photoshop. I'm going to change that to a JPEG just because that makes it slightly easier to enter into Microsoft Word at the end of this process to turn this into your process journal PDF. And I hadn't made a process journal folder to make myself hyper organized, so you see me do that here. So now I have a saved version of this file. You could always save a Photoshop version of this document so you could edit it later if you wanted to tweak it. You'll see I know I have the JPEG in the can, so I just delete the layers that I no longer need so I can begin fresh and reuse the template. The next study I'm going to tackle is the one focusing on also, in addition to studying one-point perspective, utilizing changes in value and color to create a sense of atmospheric perspective. What you might have noticed here is by clicking on the magic wand tool and hitting select subject, I was able to make a beautiful selection of the parasol. So making the mask was very easy on this one. So here, a lot of the process will be similar. I'm going to begin just by repositioning the parasol, trying to get it to fill the space between the vanishing lines in the foreground well. That part is going to go incredibly similarly. You'll see I tip it so I can have kind of the two edges of the parasol really almost touch those lines to make it a little easier on myself. It goes out of the frame a little bit, and that's also completely fine. So just like before, using Command J allows me to copy layers. So I begin just by doing the same thing, resizing when I'm using the move tool and I have that show control or show transform controls button checked. That's easy. Readjusting so it fits. But now we need to worry about changing the value and color. So you'll see my mouse is hovering over that adjustment layer icon at the bottom of the layers panel, and I'm going to hue saturation. So I start just by creating a hue saturation layer. I'm going to begin by dragging the saturation down and the lightness up, again, to create a sense of that hazy atmospheric perspective. But you'll see, since that's the hue saturation layer sitting at the top, it's affecting everything. So I'm going to go to layer and down to create clipping mask. So what you should see, and I'm going to keep turning that adjustment layer on and off, by hitting create clipping mask, when I have that adjustment layer selected, I'm saying it only affects the layer directly below it. I want to keep that process going. So I'm going to hold shift to select both that second layer and also the nice hue saturation layer and the clipping mask. So you can see it's only going to affect that now third back in space parasol. So working just to readjust and zhuzh and get it nicely fit within the linear perspective lines. Whenever that's done, I want to tweak this topmost hue saturation adjustment layer because this is a little further back in space. So it should be a little bit less saturated and a little bit lighter to keep that haze going. So you'll see I go to the extremes first to just make sure the clipping mask is working and it's only affecting that back layer. I drag up the lightness a little bit and drag the saturation down even a little bit more. And you can see that sense of atmospheric perspective has been created. So this piece now shows both one-point perspective and also those changes to value and color. So here you'll just watch me do the same saving process again. We're turning this into a JPEG version of the file and saving it to that same folder, renaming it Journal 3, and this time underscore value color. With that one in the can, we're going to move on. I maybe should have given you a trigger warning, but for the third exercise here, I'm going to use that severed finger file. Again, it is fake. It is a, I think, silicone prop finger. But we'll begin the same way. We're just having at least 3 versions of this same file fit into one-point perspective, and that's beginning pretty easily. This third exercise also needs to have the level of detail rendered change as objects get further away in space. So we know this when we're looking. We can't see the same level of detail on something that's really far away as we can see on something that's close up. So because I'm using Photoshop, the way I'm going to create this effect is going to the filter dropdown, blur, and I'm just going to choose Gaussian blur. So I am selecting that second file back in space. I'm just dragging to a kind of moderate level of blur. It's just a little bit blurrier as an image that's a little further back in space. When I recopy this image, you should see the blur effect still holds. So it's right now just as blurry as that second severed finger back in space. So I need to apply additional blurring effects on this one to really up the ante. So I'm going to drag this around a little bit so you can hopefully see the effect. You can make it quite blurry. That really does make it feel further away. And I kind of liked going with that more extreme effect. So same deal with this piece. When you go to save it, you want to save it in that same process journal folder. You want to label this one journal 3_detail. So that's my walkthrough of the Photoshop way of doing this particular process journal exercise. As, yet another reminder, this can absolutely be done as a physical drawing instead. Just pick whatever is easier to you. Hopefully by this point in the process, you are seeing maybe with one of these objects, or hopefully two of these object illusionary space studies, elements that you'd like to carry into that final character collage. Again, you'll need at least 2 methods of creating illusionary space clearly shown in your final piece. So that's all I have for you. In a future video, I'll talk through the next stage of the process, which is creating rough renderings or rough drafts.